The V3 frontier had a peculiar way of stretching time until it felt thin enough to tear. Days didn't pass so much as they drifted, like dust caught in a beam of pale starlight, each one nearly identical to the last. The sky above the outpost shimmered faintly with atmospheric distortions, residual effects from the ancient orbital grid that no one fully understood, but everyone politely pretended was under control. It gave the horizon a wavering quality, as if reality itself occasionally lost focus and had to blink. Dell had been there long enough to stop noticing, or rather long enough to pretend he had stopped noticing. He stood at his assigned position just inside the outer corridor of the diplomatic structure, posture aligned, hands loosely clasped behind his back in what the official handbook described as neutral readiness. The handbook had not accounted for the fact that neutral readiness, when maintained for several hours, began to resemble quiet regret. Dell suspected this was not an oversight, but a deliberate test of endurance. Either that, or whoever wrote the handbook had never actually stood still for more than 10 minutes. A faint hum vibrated through the floor beneath him, a constant reminder that the building itself was alive, in a way most human constructions were not. V3 architecture didn't simply stand. It adjusted. Walls shifted density in response to temperature. Corridors subtly reoriented themselves to optimize movement patterns, and the lighting adapted to the emotional state of the room. At the moment, the illumination hovered somewhere between calm and mildly concerned, which Dial felt was an accurate summary of his life. Across the chamber, a group of V3 officials moved with the kind of effortless coordination that made human diplomacy look like a rehearsal that had gone on too long. Their long ears, smooth, elegant, and impossibly expressive, tilted and shifted as they spoke, adding layers of meaning that most humans never noticed. Dial did. That was the problem. 4 years earlier, when he had first been stationed on the frontier, the silence had nearly driven him to madness. There were only so many times a person could check equipment that didn't need checking or stare at a horizon that refused to do anything interesting. It was during one of those long, uneventful rotations that he found the data archives. Technically, they weren't restricted, just ignored. Buried under layers of diplomatic records and trade logs was a complete linguistic data set of the V3 court tongue. Not a simplified translation, not a basic phrase book, but the full structure, intonation markers, contextual shifts, even the nonverbal cues embedded in posture and breath. Someone had compiled it with meticulous care, and then apparently no one had thought to use it. Dial had. At first it was a way to pass time. He would sit in the dim glow of his quarters, repeating unfamiliar sounds under his breath, trying to mimic the subtle tonal rises and falls that made the language so precise. It was frustrating in a way that felt almost personal, as if the language itself were quietly judging him, which he suspected it probably was. Over time, the frustration gave way to something else. Understanding. Not just the words, but the rhythm beneath them. The pauses that meant more than speech. The slight tilt of the head that transformed a statement into a question. The almost imperceptible shift in ear position that turned politeness into sarcasm. That part had taken him longer to appreciate. Now, standing in the corridor, he listened without appearing to listen, his attention split between the visible and the hidden layers of conversation unfolding around him. The official exchange conducted in the shared diplomatic language was as formal and predictable as ever. Trade agreements, resource allocations, the usual carefully arranged dance of cooperation and quiet suspicion. Beneath it, however, was something else entirely. Two voices, softer, more fluid, threading through the rigid structure of the meeting like a second conversation that only existed if you knew where to look. Queen Asara and her daughter. Dell kept his gaze fixed forward, expression neutral, as their words reached him with effortless clarity. If he stands any straighter, he may actually become structural support, the daughter remarked, her tone carrying a lightness that did not exist in her public voice. Dial resisted the immediate and deeply unwise urge to lean slightly to the left. The queen responded with a faint shift of posture that translated roughly to amusement. Then we should be grateful. It would reduce maintenance costs. I am serious, the daughter continued. He has not moved in 12 minutes. 12 minutes is not a long time. It is if you are watching him. Dell considered blinking more frequently, just to add variety, then decided against it. Consistency, he had learned, was key to remaining unremarkable. Also, he was fairly certain that if he started blinking on purpose, it would only make things worse. The daughter's attention lingered on him a moment longer. He could feel it, not as a physical sensation, but as a shift in the air, a subtle change in the rhythm of the room. Then, with a quiet exhale, she returned to the official discussion, her expression smoothing back into the composed mask expected of her position. The hidden conversation faded, replaced once more by the carefully measured cadence of diplomacy. Dal remained where he was, still as ever, the faint hum of the structure vibrating through his boots. He had spent years existing in this space between what was said and what was meant, a silent observer of truths that were never intended for him, and he had never once given any indication that he understood, not when the conversations turned sharp, not when they became unexpectedly personal, not even when they became occasionally absurdly funny, especially then, because the moment he did, the thought lingered unfinished as he adjusted his stance by a fraction of a degree, just enough to ease the tension in his shoulders without drawing attention. Because the moment he did, everything would change. And for now at least, he was content to remain exactly where he was, unnoticed, unremarkable, and to the quiet, hidden layer of the room, entirely invisible. The chamber was never truly silent, even when no one spoke. The Vathri had engineered their spaces with a kind of living precision that made absence feel like a presence of its own. Air flowed in careful currents, circulating not just oxygen but faint traces of bioluminescent particles that adjusted to the emotional tone of the room. At the moment, the light carried a soft silver hue, formal, attentive, slightly cautious. Dell had learned to read it the way others read faces. It was, he suspected, more honest than most faces. He shifted his weight just enough to remind himself he still existed. The movement was minimal, nearly imperceptible, but in a place where stillness was practically ceremonial, even the smallest adjustment felt like a declaration. No one reacted. That was good. Being noticed was rarely beneficial, especially when one's primary skill involved understanding things one was not supposed to understand. Across the chamber, Queen Asara sat with the same composed stillness that had made more than one human diplomat forget what they had intended to say. She did not dominate the room. She simply occupied it so completely that everything else adjusted around her. Her long ears angled slightly backward, not in hostility, but in a posture that suggested she was listening beyond what was being said, which Dal knew she probably was. Beside her, the princess had less patience for stillness. Her posture shifted in small, restless increments, her attention flickering between the official exchange and the subtle distractions that only someone accustomed to constant observation would notice. Her gaze passed over Dael again, lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. He considered blinking. He did not. "The human ones are the strangest," she murmured in their language, her voice low enough that it blended seamlessly beneath the surface of the formal discussion. Dael kept his expression neutral, eyes forward, the perfect model of a man who had absolutely no idea he was being evaluated like an unusual piece of furniture. "How so?" the queen replied, her tone smooth, unhurried. "They pretend not to see things. It is inefficient." Dael felt very briefly that this was a personal attack. "They see what they are trained to see," the queen said. "It is not the same thing." "That one," the princess continued, not bothering to lower her voice further. "He has been in this exact position for—" She paused, tilting her head slightly as if calculating. 14 minutes. Dael silently congratulated himself. That was a new record. "I am beginning to think he powers down between movements." He nearly smiled. Nearly. "That would explain the lack of blinking," she added. "That was unfair." He blinked, occasionally, strategically. The queen's ear flicked, a subtle gesture that carried the faintest hint of amusement. If he were a machine, he would likely be more efficient. Dael chose to interpret that as a compliment. The official conversation continued, a steady flow of diplomatic language that moved like carefully arranged pieces on a board. Resource negotiations, boundary clarifications, the kind of discussions that appeared cooperative while quietly measuring advantage. Dial followed it easily, but his attention remained anchored to the quieter, more revealing layer beneath. I wonder what he thinks about, the princess said. Del wondered that too sometimes. Probably nothing, she answered herself a moment later. That would be consistent. He felt once again that this was an unfair assessment of his internal life, which was, at that very moment, deeply invested in not reacting. You underestimate stillness, the queen replied. It is rarely empty. The princess made a small sound that suggested skepticism. If that is true, then he must be very full. Dal resisted the urge to adjust his posture again, if only to prove he was not, in fact, a statue with questionable design choices. The lighting in the chamber shifted subtly, the silver tone warming by a fraction, as if the room itself found the exchange mildly entertaining. Or perhaps that was just Dale projecting. He had spent enough time here that the line between observation and imagination occasionally blurred. Do you think he understands us? The princess asked suddenly. The question slipped into the space between words like a dropped object, quiet but impossible to ignore. Del's pulse did not change. His breathing remained steady. Outwardly, nothing about him shifted. Inwardly, he paused. Unlikely, the queen said after a moment. The court tongue is not easily learned. That was technically true. It had taken him 4 years, a considerable amount of patience, and more than one moment of questioning his life choices. Still, the princess said, her gaze drifting back to him, it would be amusing if he did. Del decided with great care that this was not the moment to demonstrate anything. Amusement is not always desirable, the queen replied. That depends on who is amused. There was a brief silence between them, not empty, but filled with the kind of unspoken understanding that did not require explanation. Then, as smoothly as it had begun, the hidden conversation receded, folding back into the structure of the formal exchange. Dial remained where he was, a fixed point in a room that subtly shifted around him. The hum beneath his feet continued, steady and constant, a reminder that even the most stable environments were, in truth, always in motion. He allowed himself a single, carefully measured blink, then returned to stillness. Because for now the balance held, and he had no intention of disturbing it. Not yet. The longer Dial remained in the chamber, the more the rhythm of it settled into something almost predictable. Not the words, that would have been too easy, but the space between them, the pauses, the subtle shifts in posture, the faint changes in lighting that revealed more truth than any official statement ever could. It was a system, and like all systems, it had patterns. Once you saw them, you could not unsee them. Unfortunately, seeing them also meant occasionally wanting to interfere. He had so far resisted. Across the room, a Vathri diplomat was explaining something in great detail using the shared language. It involved mineral exchange ratios, transport delays, and a series of numbers that seemed determined to become more complicated the longer they were discussed. Dal followed it well enough, but the real conversation, as always, existed just beneath it. This one has been speaking for too long, the princess murmured, her tone carrying a soft, unmistakable edge of impatience. Dial silently agreed. He believes duration adds weight to his argument, the queen replied. It adds weight to my boredom. Dial felt that this was, once again, a remarkably accurate observation. The princess shifted slightly in her seat, her long ears angling outward in a gesture that suggested she was only partially committed to the current discussion. Her gaze drifted, as it often did, eventually settling on Del. He had begun to suspect this was not accidental. He is still doing it, she said. Del did not need clarification. Yes, the queen answered. I am increasingly convinced he is doing it on purpose. That was technically correct, though perhaps not in the way she meant. Humans are capable of sustained stillness, the queen said. It is often mistaken for passivity. The princess tilted her head. You think he is not passive? I think, the queen said carefully, that we do not know. Dal appreciated that answer more than he probably should have. The diplomat continued speaking. No one interrupted him. This, Dal had learned, was not a sign of agreement. It was a sign that everyone was waiting for him to finish so they could correct him more efficiently. I would like to test something, the princess said suddenly. Dell felt very briefly that this sentence would lead to consequences. Testing implies uncertainty, the queen replied. I am uncertain. That is new. The princess ignored this. If he understands us, even slightly, there should be a reaction, something small. Dell focused very carefully on maintaining the exact same level of stillness he had held for the past. He checked internally. 17 minutes. A new record. And what do you propose? The queen asked. The princess's posture shifted, subtle but deliberate. We say something unexpected. Dial did not like where this was going. There was a brief pause, the kind that suggested the queen was considering whether this was worth the effort. Then quietly she said, Very well. Dial prepared himself. The princess leaned slightly forward, her voice lowering just enough to blend seamlessly into the ambient hum of the room. If you can understand me, she said in the court tongue, adjust your posture by exactly 1 degree. Dial remained perfectly still. Inside, however, there was a very active debate. 1 degree was extremely specific. He had in fact spent an unreasonable amount of time learning how to control his posture with that level of precision. It had started as part of the language study, understanding how physical positioning influenced meaning, and had somehow evolved into a skill that now felt dangerously relevant. He did not move, he did not breathe differently, he did not even blink. The silence stretched. I told you, the queen said after a moment. Unlikely. The princess narrowed her eyes slightly, studying him with renewed intensity. Or he is very good. Dell chose to take that as a compliment. Try something else, she added. Dell considered requesting a transfer. Instead, he remained where he was, an unmoving constant in a room full of shifting variables. The princess exhaled softly, then spoke again. If you understand this, she said, blink twice. Dale blinked once, then did not blink again. It was, he decided, a reasonable compromise between maintaining the illusion and preserving his eyesight. The princess leaned back, clearly unconvinced. He blinked. He does that occasionally, the queen said. I am aware. I have been counting. Of course she had. The official conversation reached a natural pause, the long-speaking diplomat finally concluding his explanation with a tone that suggested he expected approval. He did not receive it. Instead, another Vathri began speaking, their response concise and precise in a way that immediately reduced the previous argument to something far less impressive. Dell allowed his attention to split once more, tracking both layers of communication with the quiet efficiency he had developed over years of practice. He is either completely unaware, the princess said, or extremely disciplined. Those are not mutually exclusive, the queen replied. That is not helpful. It is accurate. The princess was quiet for a moment, her gaze still fixed on Dial. Then slowly her expression shifted, not into certainty but into something far more interesting, curiosity. I will figure it out, she said. Dial had no doubt that she would try. He also had no intention of making it easy. For now, the balance remained intact, a fragile, carefully maintained illusion, held together by stillness, patience, and the quiet understanding that some things were better left unsaid, at least for a little while longer. There were limits to how long a fragile balance could hold before something, usually small, usually unintentional, shifted it out of place. Dell became aware of that limit the moment the chamber lights adjusted. It was subtle. To anyone else, it might have gone unnoticed, just another ambient correction in a structure that constantly refined itself. But Dal had spent enough time inside Vathri architecture to recognize the difference between passive adaptation and responsive adjustment. This was the latter. The silver tone of the room cooled slightly, edging toward a sharper clarity that suggested heightened attention. Not alarm, not yet, but something had changed. Across the chamber, Queen Asara had not moved. That in itself was unusual. The Vathri did not rely on obvious gestures, but even their stillness had variation. Micro-adjustments, slight tilts, the quiet language of posture that flowed continuously beneath speech. She had gone completely still, which meant she had noticed something. Dial resisted the immediate urge to review everything he had done in the last 30 seconds. That way led to unnecessary panic, and panic led to mistakes. Instead, he maintained his stance, breathing slow, even, measured, invisible. The official discussion continued, though it had shifted as well. The tone had become more precise, the sentences shorter, as if the participants were unconsciously aligning themselves with the change in the room. Or perhaps not unconsciously. Beside the queen, the princess had stopped her quiet commentary. That alone was enough to raise concern. She was not by nature a silent observer, which meant she was observing something. Dell kept his gaze forward, fixed on a point that did not exist, his awareness extending outward in careful layers. He tracked the movement of air, the faint hum beneath his feet, the subtle shift in the emotional lighting that now hovered somewhere between alert and curious. Curious was worse. Curiosity led to questions. Questions led to attention. And attention, in this particular situation, was exactly what he had spent 4 years avoiding. "Something is different," the princess said quietly in their language. Dal did not react. "Yes," the queen replied. There was a pause, not empty, but deliberate, the kind of silence that carried more weight than speech. "He is listening more carefully," the princess continued. Dal had the distinct and unhelpful thought that he had always been listening carefully. "He always listens," the queen said. "That is not new." "Then something else is." Dal considered the possibility that existing in the same room for too long had finally caused him to be detected through sheer persistence. It would be an embarrassing way for this to end. The princess shifted slightly, her posture aligning more directly toward him. It was not overt. No one else in the room would have noticed. But to Dial, it felt like a spotlight. "I think," she said slowly, "he anticipates." That was not entirely inaccurate. "He adjusts before movement occurs," she added. "Very slightly. It is almost invisible." Dal mentally noted that his definition of almost invisible might require revision. The queen remained silent for a moment, her attention sharpening in a way that did not manifest physically, but was unmistakable nonetheless. "Anticipation requires understanding," she said. "Yes." Another pause. "Or pattern recognition," the queen continued. Dial appreciated that she was at least considering alternative explanations. "Which still requires understanding," the princess pointed out. Also true. Dial felt the first faint trace of tension settle at the edges of his otherwise controlled stillness. Not enough to show, not enough to disrupt the carefully maintained illusion, but enough to remind him that the situation was shifting, slowly but inevitably, towards something less stable. He adjusted his stance by a fraction of a degree. It was a mistake, not a large one, not even a visible one, to most observers. But in a room where two individuals were now actively searching for irregularities, it was enough. "There," the princess said. The word was quiet, precise, certain. Dial held his position. "What did you see?" the queen asked. He compensated for the shift in airflow before it reached him. Dal resisted the urge to look down at the floor, as if it might offer some kind of explanation for his behavior. "The building adjusted the circulation," the princess continued. "He moved before the current change." There was a brief silence. Dale could feel it now, unmistakably. The room had shifted from curious to attentive. "Well observed," the queen said. There was no approval in her voice, no disapproval either, just acknowledgement, which was, in some ways, worse. "He cannot do that without awareness," the princess said. "No," the queen agreed, "he cannot." Dal considered, very briefly, the possibility of suddenly developing a convincing explanation involving coincidence, instinct, or an unfortunate alignment of random movements. He dismissed it immediately. The queen's attention settled on him fully now, not visibly, not in a way that would disrupt the formal structure of the room, but completely. It was a strange sensation, being observed so precisely without any outward indication. "He has been here for 4 years," the queen said quietly. "Yes. And in that time, no one has reported any irregularity because no one was looking." Dal felt, with a certain reluctant admiration, that this was an entirely fair assessment. The princess leaned back slightly, her expression shifting, not into certainty, but into something far more deliberate, satisfaction. "I think," she said, "he understands more than he should." Dal maintained his stillness. There was no point in denying it now, not yet, but soon, very soon. The queen did not respond immediately. She studied him in silence, her gaze measuring not just his posture, but the absence of reaction within it. Then quietly, almost thoughtfully, she said something in their language that had not yet been directed at him. Let us see how long he intends to remain invisible. Dell, for the first time in 4 years, felt the distinct and unavoidable sense that his time was running out. And despite himself, he found the situation just slightly amusing. Because if they were going to test him, he had been practicing for this far longer than they realized. The shift, when it came, did not arrive as a dramatic rupture. There was no raised voice, no sudden movement, no obvious signal that the balance had finally tipped. Instead, it unfolded with the same quiet precision that defined everything in the V3 court, controlled, deliberate, and impossible to ignore once it began. Dial noticed it first in the air. The circulation system adjusted again, but this time it wasn't a passive correction. The current slowed, then redirected, forming a subtle pattern that moved across the chamber in measured intervals. It wasn't enough to disrupt anything, but it was enough to create a rhythm, a test. He remained still, resisting the instinct to anticipate it. That instinct, he now realized, had already betrayed him once. Across the room, Queen Azara spoke in the shared diplomatic language, her tone calm and steady as she addressed a point of negotiation. Nothing in her voice suggested anything unusual. To anyone listening normally, the conversation remained exactly what it appeared to be. But beneath it, "We will proceed carefully," she said in her own language, her voice soft enough to disappear beneath the surface. Dial heard every word. The princess did not respond immediately. Her attention remained fixed on him, though her posture suggested otherwise. It was an impressive display of divided focus, one that Dial could appreciate on a professional level. "I would prefer something less subtle," she replied after a moment. "That would be inefficient." "It would be faster." "Not necessarily." Dial felt a brief, almost inappropriate urge to agree with both of them. The airflow shifted again, this time slightly stronger. It moved from the far side of the chamber toward his position, carrying with it a faint change in temperature. Not enough for most to notice. Enough for him. He did nothing. The current reached him, passed around him, continued on. He did not adjust. There was a pause. "He did not compensate," the princess said. "No," the queen replied. "He is correcting his behavior." "Yes." Dell resisted the urge to acknowledge that observation. It was accurate. "Which means he knows what we are looking for," the princess added. Dell considered that, technically, he had always known what they were looking for. He had simply underestimated how quickly they would start looking for it. The official conversation shifted, moving into a new phase of negotiation. Data projections appeared mid-air, shimmering with layered information, resource flows, probability matrices, long-term projections that adjusted in real time as new variables were introduced. The Vathri interacted with them effortlessly, their movements precise, almost intuitive. Dal followed the data out of habit, his mind parsing the patterns without conscious effort. It was a distraction, but a useful one. It allowed him to remain engaged without appearing overly focused on anything specific. Unfortunately, it also gave him something else to anticipate. A minor fluctuation appeared in one of the projections, a slight inconsistency in the projected transport efficiency curve. It was subtle, buried beneath layers of data, but it stood out to him immediately. He ignored it. A moment later, one of the V3 diplomats adjusted the model, correcting the error. Dell did not react. Progress. "He is restraining himself," the princess said. "Yes." "That is almost more interesting." Dell was beginning to suspect that nothing about this situation was going to become less interesting. The lighting shifted again, warming slightly as if the room itself had decided the current state of events was worth observing more closely. The silver hue softened, blending into something more neutral. Curiosity again. "Let us simplify," the princess said. Dal felt a quiet sense of inevitability settle into place. The queen did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice carried a note of quiet approval. "As you wish." The princess leaned forward slightly, her posture aligning more directly with his position. It was still subtle, still deniable, but no longer entirely hidden. Then she spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly enough that the words, in their own language, carried with unmistakable intent. If you understand this, do nothing. Dial almost smiled. It was, he had to admit, an elegant test. Any reaction, any attempt to prove or disprove, would confirm awareness. The only way to pass was to remain exactly as he was, which fortunately was something he had spent 4 years perfecting. He did nothing. The seconds stretched. The chamber continued its quiet activity, the official conversation flowing uninterrupted, the data projections shifting and adapting as they always did. But beneath it, the silence grew heavier. "He is doing nothing," the princess said. "Yes." That is the correct response. "Yes." There was a pause. "Which means?" "Yes." Dell appreciated that the queen was efficient. The princess exhaled slowly, leaning back into her seat. Her expression shifted, not into frustration, but into something far more focused. Recognition. "He understands," she said. The words were not a question. No one else in the room reacted. The official conversation continued, the diplomatic exchange proceeding as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Dell remained where he was, posture unchanged, gaze forward, the perfect image of a soldier who had absolutely no idea he had just been identified. Inside, however, the stillness had fractured, not into panic, not into fear, but into something sharper. Awareness. The queen's attention settled on him once more, deeper now, more deliberate. She did not speak immediately. When she did, her voice was softer than before, but carried a clarity that cut through the layered noise of the chamber with effortless precision. "Then the question," she said in their language, "is not whether he understands." Dael listened. "It is why he has chosen not to speak." The princess tilted her head slightly, considering that. "Yes," she said, "that is a better question." Dale, for the first time, felt the weight of that question settle somewhere he could not ignore, because it was, unfortunately, one he did not have a simple answer to. And judging by the way the queen's attention remained fixed on him, he had the distinct impression that he would soon be asked to provide one. The moment did not arrive with urgency. It did not demand attention. It simply waited. Dael felt it settle into the room like a new layer of gravity, subtle, undeniable, and increasingly difficult to ignore. The conversation continued around it, voices rising and falling in carefully structured patterns, data projections shifting with quiet precision, the entire chamber performing its usual rhythm. But beneath it, something had changed. Not the environment, not the structure, him. For 4 years, silence had been his advantage, a shield made of patience, built one careful moment at a time. He had listened, learned, adapted, and remained invisible. Now invisibility had become noticeable, which he reflected was a deeply unfortunate development. The airflow shifted again, but this time he didn't think about it, didn't anticipate it, didn't correct for it. It brushed past him, indifferent, carrying the faint metallic scent of the chamber's internal systems. Progress, he supposed. Across the room, the princess leaned slightly forward, her attention no longer pretending to be elsewhere. It was still controlled, still subtle, but no longer hidden. "She is going to ask him," she said quietly. Dell appreciated the advance notice. "Yes," the queen replied. There was no tension in her voice, no accusation, just a simple acknowledgement of inevitability. Dell considered briefly the possibility of requesting a transfer to a less linguistically complicated assignment. Somewhere quiet, somewhere far away, somewhere without royalty. He dismissed the thought. Too late. The official conversation reached a natural pause, the kind that occurred when all parties had said enough to justify a moment of silence without appearing uncertain. It was a delicate balance, one that the Vaythri navigated with effortless precision. The silence lingered, and then, without raising her voice, without altering her posture in any way that would draw attention, the queen spoke, not in the shared diplomatic language, in her own. Dale. The sound of his name, shaped in the Vathri court tongue, was different, softer, yet more precise, as if the language itself had adjusted to fit it more accurately than his own ever had. He did not move immediately. There was a brief, very human moment where he considered pretending not to hear. It lasted approximately half a second. Then he exhaled, just slightly, and responded, "Yes, Your Majesty," in her language. The effect was immediate. Not loud, not explosive, but absolute. The chamber did not fall silent in the dramatic sense. Conversations did not stop. Data did not freeze. But something in the underlying rhythm shifted, as if the entire structure had paused to reassess its understanding of reality. The princess stared at him. Not subtly, not diplomatically, just stared. Her expression, carefully controlled for years of court life, collapsed into something far less structured. Shock, yes, but also something sharper. Mortification. Dal, despite himself, felt a flicker of sympathy. It was, after all, not every day that one discovered the decorative pillar had been listening the entire time. The queen, however, did not react immediately. She studied him. The silence between them stretched, not empty, not uncertain, but deliberate, measured. Then she spoke again. "How long?" The question was simple. The answer was not. Dal considered briefly whether there was any advantage in adjusting the truth. There wasn't. 4 years, he said. The princess made a sound. It was not a word. It was, however, extremely expressive. The queen did not look at her. Her attention remained on him, steady, precise. "And in that time," she continued, "you have understood everything we have said." It was not a question. "No," Dal replied calmly. "Not everything." A pause. The princess blinked. The queen's ear shifted slightly, the smallest indication of interest. "Explain." Dal allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. Some of it was sarcasm. The princess closed her eyes briefly, as if that might reverse the last 30 seconds. It did not. The queen, however, did something unexpected. She almost smiled, not visibly, not in a way that would be obvious to most. But Dal saw it, in the slight softening of her posture, the barely perceptible shift in the angle of her ears. It was enough. "And what," she asked, "do you intend to do with what you have heard?" There it was, the real question. Not how long, not how. Why? Dale felt the weight of it settle, heavier than anything that had come before. Not because of what he had heard, but because of what it meant to answer. He did not hesitate. "Nothing." The word hung in the air, simple, uncomplicated, absolute. The princess opened her eyes again, studying him with renewed intensity, as if searching for the part of that answer that didn't make sense. The queen, however, did not speak immediately. She watched him, not looking for deception, looking for something else. Understanding, perhaps, or the absence of it. The chamber continued its quiet motion around them, the world carrying on as if nothing had shifted, as if a fundamental boundary had not just dissolved in the middle of a diplomatic exchange. Finally, after a long moment, the queen inclined her head slightly, not in approval, not in dismissal, acknowledgement. Then, without breaking eye contact, she spoke again, in her language. "Then stay." Dal blinked, once, carefully. The princess looked between them. Her expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. "That is all?" she asked. "For now," the queen replied. She turned her attention back to the official discussion, seamlessly re-entering the formal structure of the room as if nothing unusual had occurred. But then, almost as an afterthought, she added quietly in their language, "Continue." And this time, she was speaking to him. The room did not return to what it had been, because what it had been no longer existed. Dal felt it in the smallest details first. The air still moved in controlled currents. The light still adjusted itself in response to emotional shifts. The structure still hummed with quiet, living precision. But the space between those elements had changed. What had once been divided into layers was now shared. Not openly, not completely, but undeniably. He stood where he always had, posture aligned, gaze forward, the same quiet constant he had been for 4 years. And yet, for the first time, The stillness was not a disguise. It was a choice. Across the chamber, the official discussion resumed its steady flow, the Va3 diplomats exchanging projections and proposals with their usual efficiency. Nothing about it suggested disruption. Nothing about it revealed the subtle fracture that had just reshaped the entire dynamic of the room. Except, "Your posture is less rigid," the princess said quietly in their language. Dal did not look at her. "That is because I am no longer pretending to be furniture," he replied. There was a brief pause. Then unexpectedly she laughed. Not loudly, not enough to draw attention, but enough that the sound carried a genuine, unguarded note that did not belong to the formal structure of the court. "That is disappointing," she said. "I had grown accustomed to you as architectural support." "I considered applying for structural certification," Dale said, "but the requirements were unclear." The Queen's ear shifted slightly, a gesture that now, unmistakably, meant amusement. "You would have failed," she said. "You move too much." Dal inclined his head by the smallest fraction. "I will take that as progress." The princess studied him, her earlier embarrassment replaced by something far more composed and far more curious. The sharp edge of her suspicion had softened, reshaped into a focus that felt less like interrogation and more like evaluation. "You listened for 4 years," she said, "and said nothing." "Yes. That is either very disciplined," she continued, "or very strange. I have been called both." "I believe it." Dal allowed himself a brief pause, then added, "Usually at the same time." The princess's expression shifted again, a flicker of something warmer, less guarded. She leaned back slightly, her posture relaxing in a way that would have been unthinkable only hours earlier. "You did not react," she said, "even when you could have." "No." "Why?" Dal considered the question, not the simple answer, the real one. "Because it was not meant for me," he said. The princess frowned slightly. "And that mattered?" "Yes." She glanced at the Queen, as if expecting a correction. None came. Instead, the Queen spoke. "That is rare," she said. Dale did not respond immediately. He had learned over time that silence was often the most accurate answer. The official conversation shifted again, moving toward its conclusion. Agreements were forming, variables aligning, the slow machinery of diplomacy reaching a point of temporary balance. It would not last. It never did. But for now it was enough. Beneath it, the quieter conversation continued. "You understand us," the princess said. "Completely." "Enough. That is not the same." "No," Dale agreed. "It is not." She tilted her head, studying him with renewed intensity. "Then what do you not understand?" Dale allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. "Why you assumed I couldn't." The princess opened her mouth, then stopped. Closed it again. Considered. "That is a fair question," she admitted. The Queen's attention remained on him, steady and precise. "Assumptions are efficient," she said, "until they are not." Dale nodded slightly. "That has been my experience." There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, not tense, just shared. The chamber lighting shifted once more, settling into a softer tone that felt, for the first time, entirely neutral. No longer cautious, no longer curious, balanced. The princess exhaled slowly, her posture easing further. "This is inconvenient," she said. Dal raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "I will now have to assume you understand everything I say." "That would be wise." She narrowed her eyes slightly. "I do not like being predictable. I have noticed." She almost smiled. The Queen, meanwhile, remained as composed as ever, though the subtle shifts in her posture carried a different weight now. Not distance, not detachment, recognition. "You have changed the nature of this space," she said. Dal considered that. "I did not intend to." Intent is not required. That, he thought, was probably true. The official discussion reached its conclusion, the final agreement settling into place with the quiet certainty of something that would hold, at least for a while. The diplomats began to disperse, their movements smooth, efficient, already shifting toward whatever came next. The structure of the room began to relax. the subtle tension easing as the purpose of the gathering dissolved. But the three of them remained, for a moment longer. The princess stood first, her movement fluid, controlled. She hesitated just slightly, then looked at Diel. Not with suspicion, not with embarrassment, but with something far more direct. Curiosity still, but no longer cautious. "I will test you again," she said. Diel nodded. "I would expect nothing less. And next time," she added, "I will be less obvious." "I look forward to it." She studied him for a moment, then turned, moving away with the same effortless grace she had always carried, though now there was something different in it. Less performance, more intent. The queen remained seated. Her gaze met his once more, steady, measured. Then, without speaking, she inclined her head slightly. Not a command, not a dismissal, something else. Acknowledgement. Del returned the gesture, and in that small, quiet exchange, something settled into place. Not a resolution, not an ending, but a new understanding. The walls that had once separated what was spoken from what was meant were gone. Not broken, simply no longer necessary. Del adjusted his stance, not to maintain an illusion, but because it felt right. For the first time in 4 years, he was not standing still to remain unseen. He was standing still because he belonged there. And as the chamber slowly emptied and the living structure of the Vathri court shifted into its next state, Del allowed himself a single, unguarded thought. It had taken him 4 years to learn their language. It had taken one moment to be heard. And somehow, that had been the easier part.